I wanted to do justice to a very special person who you've come to hear. So I went to Wikipedia, and if you'll forgive me, it took me back to about 1965. I was in a meeting, and I had just secured an order to supply all the T-shirts for the Beatles, who were coming to the United States. And they were going to be on the Ed Sullivan program. And Seymour Drill, the financial officer, had a wry sense of humor. And as a compliment, he said to me, "Prigoff, you're like shit." He said, "You're all over the place." So you may wonder why I start with that, but Medea Benjamin, to my surprise, or not surprise, has been in the most incredible places doing good work. And so let me just tell you some of the places that I found. Medea's lived in Egypt, all through the Middle East, Israel, Palestine, Iraq, Iran, Cuba. She spent 10 years in Cuba, Venezuela, China. Just imagine doing the good work in all of these countries. And our lives have intersected, interestingly enough. I remember when Medea wanted to go to the WTO, the World Trade Organization. It was in Cancun, and you couldn't get onto the island because they had a barrier. And it happened that Arlene and I had a place inside the barrier. So we got a hold of Medea and we said, "Why don't you make that the headquarters for global exchange?" So we kind of, over the years, had interface in many different ways, which is very satisfying to me. Medea would describe herself as a nice Jewish girl. Now, that kind of carries princess tones to it, but she's a very nice, very special Jewish girl for sure. We're just taking a look now and just see. Okay, she founded Global Exchange, which is a fair trade advocacy. That's when we came to know her. She ran for the Senate on the Green Party. Very unfortunate, she didn't win. That was too bad. We should have had Medea there. And she founded Code Pink. Code Pink is an extraordinary organization, and over again we've seen Medea right there in the forefront, getting arrested, being pushed around, this very strong human being by bigger, stronger human beings. And here she is today, smiling, when everybody should be retiring at 65. Medea's just getting started. So with her book on drones and with her new book on Iran, we've come to hear a most extraordinary person, and I thank you all for joining me. Medea, come and tell us all about it.
Much better, thank you.
Yeah, okay. So it's wonderful being here, seeing a lot of old friends and new ones. This is the beginning of our California tour for this book on Iran. Before I start, I should thank my partner right there, Tig Barry, who's a wonderful companion in all of this work, and also to say that I just got back from South Korea, and it was such an interesting time to be there. I was there with a group of women from 15 different countries as part of an international women's peace group that's been several times. The last time we were there was in 2015, where we crossed from North Korea to South Korea, pushing for peace talks. Little would we think that, lo and behold, Donald Trump would go for a summit with Kim Jong-un of North Korea. And we are actually quite delighted. We were there when it was off, and then it was on again. The day it was off, we scrambled to do a protest in front of the U.S. Embassy, a candlelight vigil in the evening. The next day we woke up and it was on again. And of course this was a roller coaster ride more for the people of Korea, whose lives are in the balance. I remember there was a reporter at the White House when Trump had called it off, and they said something like, "Well, is this part of the game?" And he said, "Well, we all play games." And the Korean people we were with said, "We don't play games. This is actually our lives. And it's not a game for us. and we want you to go home and really push that the summit happens. You know, I just went to a hearing at the Senate where it was very disturbing because you realize that there are the hawks on the right, including John Bolton, National Security Advisor, who doesn't want to see these talks be successful. And then there are Democrats who don't want to see the talks be successful. Why? Why do you think?
He's a Republican.
Right, and they don't want him to have a good win before the November elections. So for them, many of them, it's a game too, playing politics. I think we have to see things like a possible end to a 70-year conflict in the Korean Peninsula as something that is above party politics, right? We have to love peace more than we hate Donald Trump. And so I think, you know, as we go forward, let's hope these peace talks are actually successful. But it is quite ironic that he is ready to meet with and potentially make peace with an authoritarian regime that is way less democratic than the government of Iran. It's also ironic and tragic that Donald Trump, and unfortunately way too many of U.S. leaders over the years, have chosen to be allied with Iran's nemesis, Saudi Arabia, instead of with Iran. Now, the book I wrote on Saudi Arabia, which we have some copies of there, is so important because I realized that progressives didn't know just how bad Saudi Arabia is and how important it is for us to try to sever the U.S. ties with Saudi Arabia. Not only because of the repression internally. And do you remember when the Crown Prince was visiting just recently in March? And there was all this hoopla that he was a great reformer, the 32-year-old heir to the throne. And he met with like the creme de la creme of the U.S. Elites, whether it was Donald Trump, senators, congress people, then he went to MIT, Harvard, Yale, he went to meet with the people of Bill Gates, then he went to Silicon Valley, he went to Hollywood, he even had a meeting with Oprah Winfrey, and they were all celebrating him as this great reformer. Do you remember why? Well, yes, but yes, he announced that women would be allowed to drive. In the meantime, what is happening behind the scenes? The very women who have been fighting for decades for the right to drive have been thrown in prison. The women and their male allies, 17 of them thrown in prison, some of them released, there are 9 of them left in prison. And on June 24th, when you hear a lot of hoopla about the day that Saudi women entered the 21st century, because you know Saudi Arabia is the only country in the world that doesn't allow women to drive, so it's quite a low bar to be saying, yay! But remember, the Saudi women in prison, and the ones who have been fighting for so long for that right. And the Saudi women now are saying, okay, we want the right to drive, but that's just the beginning. We want the end to the guardianship system that treats them as minors for their entire lives. So Saudi women are way more repressed than Iranian women. And then you look at Saudi Arabia's foreign policies and see how horrendous it is that they are the #1 purchaser of U.S. weapons, and they're using these weapons to create the greatest catastrophe you can imagine in neighboring Yemen. And this is the country that the U.S. has allied with, instead of allying with a much more democratic but very flawed nation as well, and that is the nation of Iran. So that's, it has been said that war is the way that Americans learn geography. And I thought, what a terrible thing. I wrote this book as a way to help Americans that will read it to learn geography and history, not to make war, but to avoid war. And that's the point that we're in right now. And in the book, I give a very brief summary of the long and incredible 2,500-year-old history of the nation of Iran. I know we have one Iranian with us. Any more? Anybody else from Iran here? You want to raise your hand? Okay. You must recite poetry, because everyone...
I also lived in Saudi Arabia for 18 months.
Ah, so you can tell us about the comparison there. So Iran has this beautiful, rich culture of literature, poetry, stunning architecture. Anybody else here who've been to Iran? Yeah. Anything you want to say about your visit?
I remember the food.
The food, delicious food. So a very extraordinary culture. And then I go into what is really the important part of the history for us, which is the more modern part, to talk about the Shah, the dynasty that was so close to the UK and the US, but was also such a repressive regime, such a corrupt regime, a regime that gave away the keys to the oil industry to the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which is now BP, and which created a movement inside Iran for nationalization, not just of the oil, but a nationalist policy, to stop being a colonial state. And the movement was led by Mohammad Mossadegh, who came to power through elections in 1951 and was pushing through the mandate he had, which was to nationalize the oil industry so that the revenues would be for the Iranian people and not for the British people. And lo and behold, the British government and of course the oil company thought this was a terrible thing, because it was not only terrible for the case of Iran, but imagine the example that it was setting for other oil-rich countries, and convinced the US that we had to get involved, the CIA must get involved, which it did, and overthrew that government. This was the first covert, successful CIA operation, which was then used the following year in 1954 in Guatemala, was used in 1960 to overthrow Lumumba in the Congo, and was tried but unsuccessful in the case of Cuba and the Bay of Pigs. The important thing to understand about that coup was that it was deemed successful. And it was at the time. Indeed, Mohammad Mossadegh was thrown out, the Shah was replaced, friendly to the US and the UK government, but you have to look at what are the long-term consequences of that. And you know, Bernie Sanders, when he ran, he didn't talk much about foreign policy. He waited until after he ran, unfortunately, to give his best speech on foreign policy. And in that speech, he said this. He said, in 1953, the United States, on behalf of Western oil interests, supported the overthrow of Iran's elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, the reinstallation of the Shah of Iran, who led a corrupt, brutal, and unpopular government. In 1979, the Shah was overthrown by revolutionaries led by Ayatollah Khomeini, and the Islamic Republic was created. And then he asks, what would Iran look like today if their democratic government had not been overthrown? What impact did the American-led coup have on the entire region, and what consequences are we still living with today? And I think those are critically important questions to ask, because when the US did the, quote, successful coup, and the Shah came in with even more repression and used the oil money to buy more US weapons, and in fact became the #1 purchaser of US weapons starting in 1969 and then through the 70s, used those weapons to repress the people. There was only one place where people could go to try to organize and talk about the grievances. Anybody want to guess what that one place was?
Mosque.
The mosques, exactly, the mosques. And so that's how the clerics gained so much power, and were the ones after the overthrow of the Shah that were the most organized. And so they took over the revolution, because in the revolution there were a lot of Marxists, there were a lot of leftists. In fact, Iran has a long and very rich history of socialism. There was a party called the Tudeh Party that was very, very strong socialist party. But because the mosques were the only place where people could organize, it was the clerics who led the revolution. And the revolution, obviously, was not only anti-Shah, but it was anti-American, and it was anti-Israel and pro-Palestinian. Well, immediately after the revolution, the students thought that the U.S. was going to overthrow that revolution too. And so what did they do? Remember? They took over the U.S. Embassy. Amazing. They took over the U.S. Embassy. They kept 52 U.S. officials hostage for 444 days.
Wow.
It's quite remarkable. Imagine that. Here we got some young people. Could you imagine doing that? But in the process, it created a serious, serious breach with the United States. And this was Jimmy Carter at the time. And the embarrassment of a president having your diplomats being held by students for over a year. And those of you old enough, you might remember Ted Koppel. This is where his program was. Every night on the nightly news was an update about the hostage crisis. And so for the American people, it was ingrained in their minds that these students and the Iranian government let them do it, that they kept U.S. Diplomats hostage for so long. Well, part of the U.S. reaction to the hostage crisis was to impose sanctions on Iran. And those sanctions, in one form or another, have been placed on Iran ever since. And ever since 1979, the U.S. has tried to do something to overthrow that regime. Whether it's the sanctions, whether it's supporting counter-revolutionary efforts, using our tax dollars, hundreds of millions of tax dollars to support covert activities, support minority groups and try to get them to rebel against the central government. More recently would be cyber attacks, constant hostilities. There were times where there were less hostilities and sometimes more, but hostility was the norm until the time Obama came in, and there was a chance to create a new dynamic with Iran. And that new dynamic was to negotiate. And the negotiations took place, and they went on for a long time, and it was very difficult negotiations with compromises on all sides. And finally, in 2015, a deal was reached. The Iran nuclear deal. Now remember, this wasn't a deal just between the United States and Iran. It had our European friends, it had the Germans, the French, the British, also the Russians, and the Chinese. And it was ratified unanimously by the UN Security Council. So it was a deal that was seen by the world community as a positive development to try to bring Iran back into the global community. There was one fatal flaw in that deal as far as the U.S. support for that deal. And that was, it was never considered a treaty by Barack Obama because he didn't think he had the votes to get it through Congress, so it was never ratified by Congress. And of course the consequences of that is that you get a guy like Donald Trump. Trump said throughout his campaign, this is a terrible deal. I would never negotiate a deal like that. I would get a much better deal. It allows Iran to have a sunset clause and then it can start up its weapons again. It doesn't deal with other issues that are so important. The interballistic missiles that they have. It doesn't deal with the Iran's meddling in the region. And you know, that kills me every time he talks about meddling in the region. Because whose region is it? It certainly isn't the U.S. region. We are the ones meddling in the region. And in fact, the complaints about greater Iran influence in the region really is the result of U.S. meddling. because it was the U.S. invasion of Iraq, overthrowing a regime of Saddam Hussein that was Sunni, putting in a Shia government, and Iran is a Shia-led government, that gave Iran its influence in Iraq and then throughout the region. It's also quite ironic that Trump calls Iran the greatest state sponsor of terrorism, because I think we could think of other countries like the United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia that might vie for that title of the greatest state sponsor of terrorism. And certainly Iran does things that that increase the conflict in the region. Iran is involved in, for example, supporting the Assad regime and the brutal war there on the Syrian people. He is involved in supporting Shia militia in Iraq that have done a lot of destruction, particularly in the Sunni communities. Iran did get involved in Yemen after the Saudis got involved, then supporting the Houthis, and it became more of a proxy war. And Iran certainly has a lot of problems internally, and I talk about them in a very critical way in the book, about not allowing people to have freedom of speech, freedom of association, repression of women, repression of religious minorities like the Baha'i. Not the Jews, by the way. The Jews are considered the people of the book, and they are well loved in Iran. In fact, after Israel, it has the largest population of Jews in the Middle East. And in fact, when I traveled to Iran, I thought, it was bad enough to say you're American, but they love you when you say you're American. And then I thought, well, let me try saying I'm a Jew, see how that goes over. They love you when you say you're a Jew. They just love it. The conservative Iranians say, oh, we have the same halal meat and the same holidays and the same this and that. And I'm like, I'm not a practicing Jew, but okay. And the more liberal people say, oh, they love the Jewish creativity and the Jewish sense of humor and all kinds of things. Anyway, there was a poll done by a U.S. polling firm to look at the attitudes towards Jews in the Middle East, and they were amazed to find that it was in Iran where they had the most favorable attitude towards Jews in the whole Middle East. But the Trump, as he was campaigning, was saying, we hate Iran, Israel hates Iran, so we hate Iran, Saudi Arabia hates Iran, so we hate Iran, and one more thing. Barack Obama made this deal, and of course Trump wants to undo everything that Barack Obama did, whether it's health care, getting out of the Paris climate accords, rolling back the opening with Cuba, and this Iran nuclear deal. So he talked about how bad it was, he got in, and he pulled the U.S. out of that deal. Now that has consequences. That has a lot of consequences. And we don't know exactly what those consequences are, because a lot of it depends on what can the Europeans do to buffer their companies so that they will stay doing business with Iran, because Iran wants to get something from it. Promised its people that there would be improvements in the economy, and the economy is in a critical state. And so far, the people haven't felt the improvements. And they still have a lot of trade with the Chinese, because the Chinese have figured out ways to get around the U.S. sanctions. But the European companies are very afraid that the U.S. has secondary sanctions. So the U.S. says, we will impose fines, and big ones, on European companies that do work in Iran and that have any kind of business in the United States. Well, Iran is an untapped 80 million people. There's a lot of money to be made but compare it with trade with the United States, which one would you pick? So a lot of these companies in Europe who were going to have deals with Iran, like Airbus, like Renault, like Total, the Italian oil company, they're getting cold feet and they are pulling out. And so Iran just, was it yesterday, said, well, we're going to start doing more enrichment of uranium. And they said they'll stick to what is allowed in the deal because, you know, remember, the deal was working. And Iran was complying with the deal, and the International Atomic Energy Agency that is, whose job it is to see that Iran complies, had done 10 different reports saying Iran was complying. But Iran says, you know, we're going to start doing more uranium enrichment, what is allowed in the deal, but this is sending a signal saying to Europe, if you don't do something quickly, we're going to totally pull out of this deal. Now, also think what's happening internally in Iran, because Iran is not a monolith. There is actually a vibrant, and perhaps even vicious, political play inside Iran. And the moderates, represented by the president right now, Rouhani, staked his reputation on negotiating with the West, negotiating this deal. But lo and behold, the U.S. pulls out, and if Europe can't figure out a way to to cushion their companies against U.S. sanctions, then Rouhani is the one who suffers. And it is the conservatives who said, you should never negotiate with the West because they're a bunch of devils and they're untrustworthy. Turns out to be totally right. The U.S. is untrustworthy. So we don't know what's going to happen, but it's a very, very dangerous situation. And it's particularly dangerous because of Israel. Because Netanyahu would love to see the U.S. bomb Iran. In fact, while John Kerry was negotiating the deal, he said afterwards, the Israelis kept coming and saying, don't do the deal, bomb them instead. So that's why you see Netanyahu, who has the chutzpah, to go in front of the cameras and say, the Iranians are lying about their compliance, and the Iranians are doing this, and the Iranians are doing that. And guess what? Israel has over 200 nuclear weapons, never will publicly even state it, much less join the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Iran joined, never allow any kind of inspectors, and Netanyahu is the one that Trump is listening to say we've got to do something about Iran. And so it is a very dangerous situation, and we don't know where it's going, but we know that although Trump has been lambasting the U.S. invasion of Iraq, he is setting up the exact same thing to invade Iran. And an invasion of Iran would be absolutely catastrophic. A nation of 80 million people that has at least 1 million people in their militia, a very sophisticated fighting force, friends in the region who would go after the U.S. and its allies as well. If you think things are bad in the Middle East right now, it would be horrendous. On the other hand, Iran is critical for unraveling all of the mess that is in the Middle East right now and causing so much pain and sufferings for so many people. And there will never be an end to those conflicts unless Iran is part of the negotiations. It has to be with Iran and Saudi Arabia. It has to be with the U.S. and Russia and with the different parties in the region, such as the Turks. They all have to be together to find a solution. So we need Iran if we want to help find solutions to what is happening in the Middle East. What is the end game of the Trump game that he is playing? Yes, he wants to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons, but really what he wants to do is overthrow the regime, something that U.S. governments have wanted to do for a long time. He's being told that the end is near, that the economic crisis is terrible, that people are complaining about how the nuclear deal didn't improve their economic situation. There were protests you might have heard about in the media at the end of last year and the beginning in January of this year, where a number of different cities throughout Iran started to have demonstrations, and the Iran hawks were crowing and saying, aha, this is going to be the end, and yet those were quashed very quickly. Nevertheless, the U.S. wants to squeeze the economy so bad to support counter-revolutionary efforts, and they're supporting a group that is inside Iran, has absolutely no credibility, and that is a group called the MEK. The MEK was on the terrorist list in the United States until 2012. The MEK has no credibility inside Iran for a very simple reason. After the revolution, Iran and Iraq got into a terrible war because Saddam Hussein invaded Iran, an awful war that lasted for 8 years. The MEK, which is an Iranian group, guess whose side they were on? They sided with Iraq. They sided with Saddam Hussein. They killed lots of Iranians. They will never be considered legitimate inside Iran. But people like John Bolton are great fans of the MEK, goes to their meetings, get paid by them, just like Rudy Giuliani has been to their meetings 9 times, get paid a lot of money by them. And they're setting up, just like you might remember in the days of Iraq, the Iraq National Congress that was set up with Ahmed Chalabi, who had no base of support in Iraq. They're doing the same thing with this group, the MEK. And there are those who say that the end game is really not just to overturn the government, but the end game is really to see chaos and civil war inside Iran that would end up with a divided Iran in many different pieces. And it seems that that is what Israel wants, because Iran is too big a nation for them. They don't want to deal with a nation of 80 million people. They want to deal with smaller states that they can easily dominate. And so the kind of chaos that could result if the Trump administration listens to Netanyahu could be truly, truly disastrous for the Iranian people and the whole region. So where do we go and how do we try to stop this? A couple of things. Congress is actually trying to do one good thing, or some members of Congress, which is to pass an amendment saying that Trump does not have the right for it to do any military action in Iran without the approval of Congress. Now, of course, this is what the Constitution says. You know, the Constitution says that it is Congress that has the responsibility for declaring war and not the president, although Congress is constantly abdicating its role in that. But that is something to press for, to make it very clear if the Constitution is not enough to say that Donald Trump does not have the right to invade Iran. You might say, and I'm pretty cynical as well, well, you don't want to give Congress that ability because they'll just okay war, because they do it most of the time. But you know, there was a time when they didn't, and that was in 2013. And if you remember, that was when Barack Obama said that Syria, the Assad government had crossed the red line and he was going to go to war. And there was an outcry. And it was very interesting because it was an outcry from the left and the right, and it was during the summer recess, and it was in August. And I remember, and Ty, you remember this very well, I'm sure, because the Tea Party was having a big meeting, and we had set up a peace encampment in front of Congress to say, no, we will not allow Obama to take us into another war. And lo and behold, we saw that the Tea Party was having a huge meeting down a couple of blocks away. And we went over, and they hate us, you know, Code Pink, the Tea Party. And we said, wait a minute, I think there's something we might agree on, because it's against Obama. And that is, he wants to take us to war with Syria. And they said, oh my God, we don't want to go to war with Syria, because Obama, we don't want Obama to take us to war. And we said, well then come join us, and go down into the Congress, and tell Congress you don't want a war. And there we were, like Pied Piper Piper is leading the way with these Tea Party people going after us. And the right-wing Freedom Works and the Koch brothers, they all started alerting their people and said, Obama wants to take us to war, we don't want that. And we, of course, were alerting people on the left. And together, in fact, what one congressional office said to us in August, the sleepy August in Washington, D.C., they said our phones were melting from all the calls we were getting saying no to another war. So we did manage. Of course, it did help that the UK Parliament had voted against the UK going to war as well. But that is an example of stopping a war. So we can do it again, and we have to do it in the case of Iran. There's other things that we can do, and we're trying to shore up our friends in Europe. And you know, the Europeans are getting to the point where they really hate Trump. The ambassador in Germany, his first day on the job was May 8th. His first day on the job, he put out a tweet, and I'll tell you the exact words of the tweet because it did not land well in Germany. In fact, the paper that day said the German ambassador, the U.S. ambassador to Germany is suddenly the most hated person in Berlin. And he said, the real Donald Trump, you know, that's the Twitter handle, real Donald Trump, said, U.S. sanctions will target critical sectors of Iran's economy. German companies doing business in Iran should wind down their operations immediately. They did not take well to being told by the U.S. ambassador. In fact, the head of the European Council then said, with friends like this, who needs enemies? So we need to shore up the spine of the Europeans. We need to create divisions between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. And we actually came very close in March when there was a vote to stop weapons sales to Saudi Arabia because of the catastrophe in Yemen. We got 44 senators. Now, given that it is an unconstitutional, disastrous war that is creating famine for millions of people. In fact, the Saudis are using famine as a weapon of war. You would think we could get like all of the Senate to vote against it. But the fact that we got 44 means we only need 7 more. And there is another weapons sale coming up very soon. And we're going to try very hard to get 51 senators on that. Now, I have a job for you, which is Kamala Harris. Now, Kamala Harris actually voted the right way, but it took her to the last minute to announce how she was going to vote. And I know we confronted her in Congress, and this was like a week before the vote, and she said she still hadn't decided. Dianne Feinstein, on the other hand, was a co-sponsor of the legislation. So imagine that. This vote is going to come up, the resolution is going to come up very soon. We need Kamala Harris to be an initial sponsor of that legislation. So any help you can give us of calling Kamala Harris's office and saying she should be the first in line to say no more weapons to Saudi Arabia. The other thing we have to do is lessen the ties with Israel. And I know there's a lot of people in this room that have been working on that for a long time, and it's starting to have an impact, because if you can have a very well-respected and well-loved, in fact, the most well-loved politician in the entire country, Bernie Sanders, talk about Palestinian rights and speak out against Israel when they're murdering people, nonviolent protesters in Gaza, and he still has his position, and people still love him. And I talked to his foreign policy person recently, and I said, did AIPAC come storming into his office? You know, there must have been terrible consequences for that. They said, no, they came in to, you know, talk to us, but, you know, we heard them out, and it was no big deal. So that means that the way is open for the progressives like Elizabeth Warren, like Kamala Harris, like Cory Booker, the rising stars in the Democratic Party. They must at least take as good a position as Bernie Sanders on Palestine. And that's our job to get them there. So that's another one to put in the Kamala Harris job list. And then finally, I want to say that in the end, what this is all about when you dig beneath the surface as well is about who profits from war, who keeps us in the constant state of war. And this is indeed the weapons manufacturers that make so much money from constant violence. And so we at Code Pink, along with other groups, have started a new campaign that we're very excited about called Divest from the War Machine. And it's got a number of different components to it. We're very excited to be working with the young people from Parkland who have been so fabulous on saying that we have to get out of supporting these weapon companies and the NRA and working them to expand to all the military companies. And we are creating, it's going to be revealed, announced very soon, a weapons-free fund that is for civilian weapons as well as military weapons. And we are now getting investment firms to sign up for it. Some of them nicely, and some of them through a campaign like BlackRock, where we have been going to their shareholder meetings and getting inside the meetings, where we have been going to their offices to protest, where we're joining up because they also are investing in an Israeli military company called Elbit. And so a number of different groups coming together to push them. This Divest from the War Machine also is getting students to say, where are the university monies invested? And we want to see if you are invested in the war machine. We're working with a wonderful group in San Luis Obispo that just got their university tried to sanction them for doing this work. They finally won, all charges were dropped against them, and they are very anxious when the fall comes around again to take up this campaign and demand that their university stop investing in war. And it also is something to do in cities, and Sacramento would be a great city to do that, to force our cities to stop investing from war. And finally, there's a component of it that was encouraged by Barbara Lee, who said, you know, there are very few Democrats who actually take money from the NRA now. But there are a lot of Democrats, and of course a lot of Republicans, who take money from the weapons manufacturers. And so we started a campaign to say no to the NRA and no to the Big Five. And that is Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, General Dynamics, and Boeing. And we have a handful of Congress people who have already signed on, but we are looking to get more and more and more of them, and we would like your support in that campaign as well. And the last thing I want to do is take a moment to think again, as I started out, about Korea. Because in late 2016 and early 2017, very underreported in the US media, there was what's called a candlelight revolution in South Korea. And every day during their winter, people came out on the streets in cities all over South Korea to protest against a corrupt government, governed by a woman, President Park, and demand that the elected officials impeach her. They came out day after day after day to say, impeach President Park. Impeach President Park. And lo and behold, after doing this night after night, after getting 1 out of 3 South Koreans out on the streets, millions and millions of people, they got her impeached. And they got into power President Moon on a mandate to not only stop corruption, but a mandate to make peace in the peninsula. And so what he is doing now is carrying out the people's mandate. So as we go forward, let's think about the people of South Korea. because we have a big lesson to learn from them. How they take a corrupt, narcissistic, reckless, dangerous person who is in power, get him impeached, and replace him and the others in power with people who will carry out the mandate for peace, both domestic and international, instead of being in the pockets of a war machine that makes a killing from killing. So let's follow in the path of South Korea and put a new government in power that reflects our values and will allow us to be a force for peace in the world. Thank you.
I recall being in the First Baptist Church in San Francisco, and at the end of the presentation, the pastor said, "Lock the doors." And then everybody filed up in front and gave their offering. Now, I'm not going to ask them to lock the doors, but we did gather to hear all of this incredible information, and it really was an eye-opener. And we want you to read the book, so hopefully, at this point, many of you will come forward and purchase the book, learn more about it, and I can't tell you how grateful we are to you, Medea, for everything that you've done, for your inspiration and your smile, your energy, it just is undiminished, and hopefully we can all count on it. Thank you so much.
Dan.
In town and country too. Let's labor now for building peace. Working for peace today.
Okay, now there's words on your table if you'd like to join us. We've left words on your table. Or you want to sing with us? I don't need it. The next song is America is Already Great.
It turns out the present is a little too late. For America's already more than quite great. Not because of the sameness, the opposite's true. Its greatness is far more than red, white, and blue. It's straight, gay, and female, it's Gentile and Jew. It's transgender, Christian, and atheist too. African and Asian, every kind of Caucasian, able, disabled, Clean air, clean water, a livable planet, healthcare for all and a lot of mass transit, enough food for everyone, that's what we sing. These are a few of our favorite things. Union protection for every worker, good public schools and safe infrastructure, funding for artists and scientists too. These are a few of our favorite things. When the press tweets something loony, we know what we'll say. We stand by our neighbors no matter their race, their lifestyle or freedom of press is in our Constitution. Breitbart's hot news, it just causes confusion. Alternate facts and fake news fill their day. Can't we just somehow make them go away? We have a challenge like no one before us, saving our grandchildren's future and more thus. We will resist and persist till the end, singing to reclaim the country again. When the press tweets something loony, we know what we'll say. We stand by our neighbors no matter their race, their lifestyle or how they
And our last song is, we're going to sing to a peaceful revolution.
They say the grand experiment has gotten off the tracks. A nation run by people, not by corporation acts. We must reverse the present trend before it breaks our backs. The revolution's come. Sing a peaceful revolution. democracy has ever been the function of our creed. There's no shining rose and run by avarice and greed. Let's make our voices heard and give democracy a beat. The revolution's come. Sing a peaceful revolution. Sing our changing constitution. Be a part of the solution. The revolution's come.
Thank you for singing with us, and welcome to Medea. We're so honored to have you here.
Thank you.